ready for a very wonderful event. Welcome to the Jackson Hole China Special Hole China Forum today. We have a very special guest. But before we introduce our guest, I want to introduce our dean, Ambassador Christopher Hill. He has been our dean for over a year, and he was head of Forum once. So this time is his guest. So I have the honor to have our dean to give a few words before our talk.
Thank you very much, Srishan, but I don't think these people came to hear me. I think they came to hear truly a very distinguished visitor. Just delighted to have Mike Chinoy here. I've worked with Mike and played with Mike over the years in East Asia. And for those of you who haven't seen these documentaries, or the first of these documentaries, you're really in for a treat. I mean, to see, Barbara Walters back in the day, and but Mike spent many years in East Asia, and particularly many years was in China, reporting on China for CNN. And Mike, we're just delighted to have you here, and frankly, we like you back. So take it away.
I'll come back.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now it's my distinguished honor to introduce our guest speaker today, Mr. Mike Chinoy. He's currently a researcher or fellow at China-US or US-China Institute at the University of Southern California. But he has been a reporter, has a very distinguished journalist career, working for all major U.S. networks. But most of his career, he spent time in Asia as a reporter of the CNN. And for me to see him first time was on TV. I remember during the Tiananmen Square in 1989, he stood on the Beijing Hotel, the balcony, looking down on the Tiananmen Square with all those very impressive pictures, photos of those tanks, demonstrators, the troops, the army, people, and talking about those very exciting events, or very sad events. And so after his journalist career, he became one of us, the academics, to record that part of history. In fact, he made quite a few films, documentaries about China, about Taiwan, and North Korea. And he showed a very interesting documentary yesterday. I don't know how many people in this room were there yesterday, and talk about Nixon's visit to China. This year is the 40th anniversary of the China-US starting normalization in 40 years ago. So he made those part of history in a documentary. And also he made another very interesting film. He was going to show the film today. I told him maybe we can just let people to watch them online, because it's online. Hopefully some of you already watched them online. That is the American Western journalists when they were in China the first time. So today I think we'll have him to talk a little bit about how the China and the US-China relations in the eyes of the reporters, the journalists, their eyes. So without further ado, we just give the floor to Mr. Chinoy, and we can have more interactive dialogue afterwards.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and as Chris said, we had a lot of dealings with each other over the years when I was a journalist. He was always one of the most reliable of those diplomatic sources that you always see quoted in journalistic accounts. So I'm particularly pleased to be here. I don't really have any special prepared remarks, and I hope most of this can be conversation and discussion. Maybe I should say a few words about sort of journalist in China over the years, and then I'm happy to talk about whatever other things you're interested in. Just to maybe also a brief bit of background on me. I first went to China in 1973, a year after Nixon, for a month with a student group. And then I was based in Hong Kong from 1975 to 1983 as a China watcher, back in the days when American journalists were not able to get to China easily, and until 1979 were not allowed to be based there, covering China and the rest of Asia. I then joined CNN in 1983 when it was barely 2.5 years old, and was known with some justification as Chicken Noodle News, because it was a pretty rinky-dink operation, and stayed with CNN until 2006. I served as a roving correspondent in London. When I joined CNN, there were only 4 foreign correspondents, so we kind of had the whole world as our beat. It was a great assignment. I spent a lot of time on airplanes, but I got to see Europe, Africa, Asia, you name it. And then in 1987, I opened the CNN bureau in Beijing. And 1987 was particularly, 87, 88 was one of the most open periods in China since the reforms got there, and then it all sort of came crashing down with the Tiananmen Square crisis in 1989. And I then stayed on until 1995 and watched the reform process get back on track. In fact, this week is the 20th anniversary of Deng Xiaoping's famous Nanshun, his southern tour, in which Deng, after Tiananmen, realized that the only way the Communist Party was going to survive was not just through repression, but through delivering the economic goodies to the public. And he went to Shenzhen in South China and essentially laid the groundwork to jumpstart the economic reform process, and that paved the way for the boom that has followed since. In '96, I moved to Hong Kong and spent the decade after that based in Hong Kong as senior Asia correspondent, and my beat extended from Afghanistan to Pakistan to Southeast Asia to China and North Korea, where I've made 15 visits, most recently last August. And then I left CNN in 2006, went to USC, spent 3 years researching and writing a book on North Korea called The Meltdown, the inside story of the North Korean nuclear crisis, in which Chris is a prominent figure and was a very useful source, along with one of the 250 people I interviewed for the book. And the last couple of years I've been working at the U.S.-China Institute at USC, and the main thing I've been involved with has been developing these documentary film projects on interesting China-related issues intended both for educational use and to be accessible to the general public. The most ambitious of which is this 8-part series on the history of American reporters in China from the 1940s to the present day. I showed our episode on the media and Nixon's China trip last night. There's another one that follows it, available on our website, china.usc.edu, that tells the story of the first American journalists who were allowed to be based in Beijing after 1949, which happened after the U.S. and China established diplomatic relations in '79. One of the themes, both from the Nixon trip and from the film on the first group that came to China to be based there, is just what a tough assignment China was. In many ways, it was a closed society. People were afraid to talk to reporters. The government actively discouraged people from talking to reporters. You had to get permission to go virtually anywhere, to do almost anything, and all of the reporters talked about how tough it was to just get around and get any sense of what it was like, let alone have any kind of meaningful or unrestricted access or interaction with Chinese people. When I arrived in Beijing in 1987, it was a little bit better, but the rules for reporters were still that you had to get permission in writing 10 days in advance. If you wanted to travel outside Beijing, you had to write to the Foreign Affairs Office of the local government, wherever it was you were going, and tell them why you wanted to come, what you wanted to do, who you wanted to interview, what you wanted to film. The authorities were often not very sophisticated about this. I remember going to Shenyang in northeast China. We said we want to visit an automobile plant. So they took us to the plant, and we got there, and there weren't any workers. And they said, here's the plant. I said, well, where are the workers? They said, well, you didn't say you wanted to film the workers, you just said you wanted to film the plant. So, you know, they had no sense of sort of what the needs of the media were. And that was not untypical. But then there was Tiananmen, where the lid got even tighter. But I think, in fairness, you have to say that the conditions today for reporters are dramatically better than they were. There are still lots of problems. I'm happy to talk about them. But because of the Olympics, the Chinese passed a new regulation that essentially made the whole country, with the exception of Tibet and Xinjiang, open to go without permission. So now you can get on a train or a plane or in a car and just go. No one's going to stop you. In principle, you're allowed to talk to anybody who's willing to talk to you. Again, that's often not honored in practice, and often there are local officials who are very suspicious and so on. But it makes China a much more sort of normal beat. You can just get to a lot more places, a lot easier. You can have Chinese friends. When I lived in Beijing, foreigners had to live in these foreign diplomatic compounds. And they weren't great, and we didn't like them, and we had no choice. Now, you can just rent a place anywhere. When my son moved to Beijing after graduating from Columbia a couple of years ago, we just rented a little apartment in these Chinese courtyards with Chinese neighbors, no problem at all. The ability to sort of interact with Chinese life and just get a sense of it is much, much greater. The other thing, I think, is that China itself is obviously a much, much more open society. And so while there are still loads of occasions where reporters have problems with officials or with people who are uptight, it's not uniform the way it used to be. And the internet, in particular, has really provided a window on China in a way that we never had before. I mean, when I first went there, you were sort of studying the People's Daily for clues. Now people are on, Sino Weibo, microblogging about all kinds of stuff, and the technology can't keep up with the information despite the efforts at control and censorship. So it's still a very challenging beat, and it's a sensitive time in China now for a lot of reasons. There's a leadership transition. The government is very, very anxious. There are tremendous tensions in the society. It's not surprising because when you look at China, you forget the Chinese had sort of compressed into 3 decades what it took the West over a century to do in the Industrial Revolution, and look at the dislocations the Industrial Revolution produced in the US and Europe. And the Chinese are doing this faster on a much larger scale and starting from a much lower base. So it is not surprising that you have tremendous tension. I mean, you have almost 200 million people who have left the countryside and gone into the cities in 20 years. It's the largest single population movement of our times. So that there are tensions in society should come as a surprise to anyone. But the challenge for China is how to manage these tensions. And again, I think here, the reality is that they have done a lot better than anybody could have expected them to. People talk about Tiananmen in 1989. What's amazing to me is not that there was one Tiananmen, but that there haven't been 50 of them, considering the upheaval that the society has experienced, the levels of transformation. But it's a particularly anxious time now. The government is, they're going to have new leaders. They're struggling to figure out sort of the direction to go. They have tremendous problems with corruption, with sort of local unrest. They have these mega issues like how terrible the environment is, the aging population, the lack of a social safety net, all of these kinds of things. I mean, I just was saying to somebody before, can you imagine what it's like to be the president of China and wake up and look in your inbox? It's scary. So it's not surprising that there's a degree of uptightness, and this sort of comes in flows with, if you look at the last 30 years, you have periods of relaxation, periods of tightening, periods of relaxation, and they're in a sort of period of tightening now, but I don't know that that's necessarily the last word. So it's still tough in the fallout from the upheaval in the Middle East last winter. The Chinese really tried to intimidate the international press corps to prevent them from covering anything that smacked of that. Journalists still have some issues with visas, access. There are places, particularly in Xinjiang and Tibet, you can't go. But on balance, China is a much, much easier place to work as a journalist, and you have far fewer constraints than before. But the challenge is, because China was sort of, to some degree, it was like almost monolithic back then in the 70s and 80s. Now, even though you can do more, the society is so much more complicated and so much more varied, you can get so much greater access to it, that figuring out what is actually going on and whether what's going on in place A is representative of some broader trend, it's almost impossible. I mean, 5 people, 3 people to cover 1.4 billion people. And so it's particularly when what is happening in China now, I like to see it as it's a process. It's not an event. I mean, there's breaking news in China, but most of what's going on is a process of transformation, and that doesn't easily lend itself to the format of conventional journalism, which is an 800-word story. This happened today, and this bomb went off. This leader said this. That doesn't do justice to a lot of what's going on in China. So even though the conditions are better, they're not great, and there are a lot of challenges. And the nature and sort of getting a handle on what is the story and conveying that is really hard. And I think in some ways it's harder. So it's a sort of mixed bag. But if it's anything, it's more important now than it was then, just given the importance of China in the world. So anyway, let me stop there, and you can take this anywhere you want.
Okay, so let me start the conversation. He talked about how the changes have taken place in China, and how the conditions for the journalists to work in China. I have been in this country for almost 30 years. For me to look at the American coverage of China, I see 2 defining moments for myself. One is 1989, the Tiananmen Square. I remember the TV, from morning you turn on TV, and evening before you went to bed, China was there all the time. That was one defining moment for the American people to see the leadership, to see the Chinese people, to see the Chinese scene on the TV. Another defining moment, I think, was 2 years ago, the Olympic. At that time, also people turn on TV on China. China was on the TV. China was competing with the U.S. for those medals. How many China got, how many American got. So Americans have those kind of coverage of China. For so many years, how do you think of the Western coverage of China? I mean, basically here, you had improved conditions. How do you think the media have conveyed the images of China to the Western audience? Have they done a good job?
It's a mixed picture. Partly, it's very hard to generalize because media can mean the New York Times, it can mean Fox News, it can mean the National Enquirer. So it's very hard to generalize. And I will also make a distinction between reporters on the ground in China and their editors, their pundits, their columnists, and the overall sort of tone of what goes out. I would say, on balance, the reporters on the ground for serious news organizations in China are well aware of the pitfalls and struggle every day with trying to figure out both what's a story and how to convey this whole process. It's not easy, but I would give them a lot of credit for making serious, honest effort to understand the place that they're at and try and convey it. The totality of the impressions, though, is a somewhat different case, and I think that's partly a function of the limitations of the medium. As I say, if you only have, the average AP story is 700 words, the New York Times story is 800, 900 words, average CBS or CNN piece is 2 minutes. I think the main print media have done a reasonably good job most of the time. I think the broadcast networks have really fallen down because they simply don't pay attention to China. And I include in that both the domestic CNN network, MSNBC, Fox, as well as the big three, ABC, NBC, CBS. You know, if you go, there's a wonderful resource called the Tyndall Report. It's a guy who charts the number of minutes that the evening newscasts on networks devote to any particular topic. It's great if you're doing research. And if you go look at the amount of reporting on China, it's just minuscule. It comes in spurts, usually around a big event like the Olympics or the Sichuan earthquake that year. But on an ongoing basis, China might as well not exist, or it's an afterthought. And so, so that's one problem. Another problem is that news organizations take their cues about topics to cover in part from what's on the U.S.-China diplomatic agenda. This is not to say that they color what they write on that somebody, you know, somebody's critical of China, so they write a story that's critical of China. But if cyber snooping is an issue in Washington, or if the trade imbalance is an issue in Washington, or if Chinese relations with North Korea or Iran are an issue in Washington, they tend to get covered. So to some degree, what's on the diplomatic agenda affects the choice of topics. I don't think it, I mean, even all my years at CNN, nobody ever said, you know, Clinton's going on about human rights in China, so go trash China on human rights. But in the mid-90s, when the Clinton administration linked renewal of China's most favored nation trading status to demands that China take certain steps on human rights, we did a lot of human rights stories because it was a hot issue. And we did it however we thought made sense. But and right now, in the last couple of years, the rise of China, the perception that China is kind of taking American jobs or challenging America for supremacy or as potentially a threat, that's part of the political dialogue here. And so that gets reflected back in the media as a topic of discussion. And I think they're valid issues. They're absolutely valid issues. And it's news when a candidate for president goes after China. So you can't not cover it. And I'm not sure that I have an easy solution to it, but I think since I think in some respects the most important part of what's happening in China is this bumpy, slow, messy, uneven process of transformation that doesn't lend itself to being pigeonholed in a news story, you get a disproportionate amount of attention overall on these other issues, which lead to certain impressions of China without enough of the countervailing, of the other elements of the story. And that I find disappointing and frustrating. And as I say, I'm particularly fault the broadcast networks here. I think they are really falling down on the job. And I'd like to think that senior executives at the broadcast networks ought to say, if part of our job is keeping the American public informed, that China is arguably, you know, the change in China, the rise of China is arguably the single most important event of our times, we have a responsibility. I would call it CNN who said that one of the great failures of American television was its failure to make the important interesting. And I think that's something that I really see, and I'm very critical of in a lot of the media coverage. But I think if you clipped out every serious article that was filed by reporters for the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, you know, there's some lapses, but you get on balance a reasonable view of a lot of the main things going on. Not at all true with TV.
We'll open up in a few minutes here. He mentioned that the coverage has, the reporters, the networks have tried to do their best to cover China, although it has not been ideal. And especially when I was in China, people always talk to me about several issues. Two of them are, one is that in China they have this unbalanced coverage. Chinese side have a lot of coverage of the U.S. Chinese people, they said they know a lot about the U.S. I don't agree with that, but they try to convince me we know about U.S., we know NPA, all those kind of players. all those American what's going on in the U.S., but the U.S. has not been doing as good as the China's covered the U.S. to some extent. I'm sympathetic to that because when you go to China, you watch all those evening news. Other than the Chinese leaders' activities, they have a lot of coverage of international news. In the U.S., other than CNN, you don't see many international coverage. So that's one criticism they have about American media. The second criticism they have is U.S. has a bias. Media has a bias against China. You mentioned that. Talk about those issues, especially during Olympics. And I remember also CNN, that anchor, he talked about Chinese using those words. Chinese side has so strong reaction. Those student demonstrators, they in fact protest CNN to boycott CNN during the Olympic time. So how do you respond to these two criticisms?
I think the first criticism is not one that you would hear only from China. I think, again, particularly in the broadcast media, there's appallingly little news on the rest of the world, and what is there is often either it has to be a kind of cataclysmic event like Gaddafi gets overthrown and killed, or a revolution in a key U.S. ally like Egypt, or it's got to have some direct relationship to the United States. The notion that the television sort of be a window on the world is really lost. And I think it's true that just in terms of knowing what, if you watch CCTV, there's probably more news about different parts of the world more regularly than if you watched the major networks here. And that's a failing not only related to China. And it's ironic to me at a time when globalization has made the world ever more interconnected, and what happens in these remote, distant places can have a much more direct impact on the United States than was true 20, 30 years ago. The mainstream media, particularly the broadcast media, are really falling down in terms of conveying it. So I think that's a valid point, and I don't think it's an exclusively Chinese criticism. On the second one, I would characterize it very differently. I would say most major Western journalists in China, you talk about, there's tremendous sensitivity in China, you're biased, you're anti-China. I don't think that's true. Most American and Western journalists come from a culture where the role of journalism is to challenge the powerful, to shine lights in dark corners and unearth information that powerful interests would just as soon see not unearthed, to be a voice for the voiceless, to be skeptical of everybody in authority. And that's true whether you're a journalist in China or Russia or Thailand or Malaysia or Israel or South Africa. That's the tradition of American journalism. And American journalists or Western journalists go to China and they confront a society where the Chinese Communist Party has tried for decades to control information. It's a very important source of its political power, and it's also a society that has a very mixed and ambivalent relationship with outsiders. And look, no society likes foreigners coming in and washing their dirty laundry in public. Unfortunately, that's what Western journalists do. And they do it here too. When Chinese friends have complained to me about all this negative coverage, I say, look at the coverage of Abu Ghraib. Look at the coverage, the number of American politicians who had to resign from office because the media reported, Elliot Spitzer was governor of New York and frequented prostitutes and he had to resign. I mean, so this is not, it's not going into China and exclusively trying to embarrass China. So I don't think it's a conscious agenda. The reality is most American reporters like China enough that, like me, they're willing to live there, they're willing to bring up their I had a wife and 2 kids and a dog and lived in China for 8 years, and I wouldn't do it if I hated China. And there are lots of reporters who are like that. So, so that's one side of it. The other side is that there are a lot of things that are happening in China that are contentious. there are conflicts, and they're going to get covered. And I think Chinese sort of see a degree of, deliberate planning. We're going to do this to embarrass China. The reality is, in the news business, it simply doesn't work that way. Stuff happens, you try and cover it. In relation to Tibet, it's very, very complicated because there's a narrative in China about Tibet, which is Tibet's part of China, and the tensions in Tibet are the result of people who want to break Tibet away from China and make it independent. And there's a narrative that is widely accepted in the West. I'm not making a judgment about the validity of the narratives, but the narrative that is widely accepted in the West is that the poor Tibetans have been stomped on by the Chinese who have mistreated them. The Dalai Lama is this kind of rock star figure, and he has all his friends in Hollywood, and he has a lot of sympathy and a lot of support. And then you had a series of riots in Lhasa in March of 2008, where the Chinese essentially didn't allow any journalists to go. There was one journalist who happened to be there, James Miles of the BBC, and his reporting was far and away the most balanced. The other journalists were sitting in Beijing, getting second or third hand information, getting nuggets from the Tibet Information Network, which is a network of Tibetan exiles who hate the Chinese. But stuff is happening, you have to file, and if you can't go there, you don't. And the timing has nothing to do with Western journalists. It happened. It's not the doing of the journalists that it happened. But the narrative, the combination of the narrative that a lot of Western journalists brought, and the way in which there was a lack of information, was a major factor in this. And it's interesting, the following year, in Xinjiang, when you had riots, the Chinese, whatever their complaints about Tibet, really learned a lesson. They let the Western press go. They set up a press center, which even though they cut internet access off for everybody else in Xinjiang, people could get online and file their stories. They let reporters go out with Chinese soldiers who were trying to, security people who were trying to keep the peace. And the coverage from Xinjiang, which clearly they didn't like in general because it was about tension and ethnic conflict, but I think it was much more balanced. And on the specific thing with CNN, two things happened. And again, the reality is more complex. There was a photograph of rioting in Tibet, which, as I understand it, some overnight editor at CNN.com cropped for purely visual reasons in a way that made it look like it was the Chinese security forces who were entirely at fault. That was not the notion that there's some on high, some decision, oh, let's do this to make China look good. It doesn't work that way. It's 3 o'clock in the morning in Atlanta, photo comes in, oh, it looks better if we crop it, bing, out it goes on the website. And then people take great umbrage at it. And Jack Cafferty, whose comments so infuriated the Chinese, is a commentator. He's not a reporter. He never goes in the field. His role at CNN is to be the curmudgeonly grouch who says rude things about everybody. And I think personally that it's not my cup of tea on any level. And he said plenty of rude things about our political leaders. But he said rude things about the Chinese. But the distinction, which should be fairly clear here, is completely lost in China, partly because they don't have that same distinction. In 100 years, Jack Cafferty is never going to be sent by CNN or anybody else to be a field reporter. His job is to sit there and bloviate, and that's essentially what he did. But these two things, in the very heated context of the Olympics, which the Chinese authorities saw as their great moment, sort of China's moment in the sun, being spoiled partly by the rioting in Tibet, which is embarrassing to them, and then the coverage of it, which is embarrassing as well, triggered this extreme response in China. So I think the reality of which led to death threats. My old friends at the CNN bureau in Beijing had to vacate the bureau and operate out of a hotel for a while. It was very, very ugly. Because people in China, and there's another component here, which is there's nationalism is a very strong sentiment in China, and the Chinese government has cultivated it very strongly, national pride, China's strong emerging power taking its rightful place. and so and in Chinese history, nationalism and has had a streak of xenophobia and all the rest of that. Go back a long time and see that. And so that's another factor that leads to kind of extreme sensitivity to slights real and imagined. So it was a sort of witch's brew that boiled up in the spring. But then you had the earthquake, where the press got in immediately, and I think that shifted the attention away and showed a different picture of China, and in much way a more positive, for all the controversies about the buildings that fell down and so on. It showed a different side of China, and I think undid some of the damage. But in all of this, it's not a black or white, and this is when I will end this very long riff here by saying when people ask about bias in coverage of China, I think if there's any bias I would have, it's towards complexity. None of this stuff is black and white. It's all multiple shades of gray, and that is very hard for people on either side to accept, and even harder for journalists to try and capture in the kind of limitations of format and time and so on that a lot of the conventional media is faced with.
I have an last question, then we'll look down. In your so many years covering China and the China-US relationships, what do you see the leaders you have met in China and the US? They have played the role, negative or positive, to promote or to prevent the relationship from moving forward. I mean, at a personal level, what stories you can tell the audience?
That's a hard one. I mean, I didn't spend a lot of time hanging out with leaders.
But the Chinese on both sides, other than our team.
Well, I mean, both countries approach the relationship from the point of view of national interest. And, I interviewed Jiang Zemin in 1991. And, I have to say, and I wrote this in my book about China Live, that I was not very impressed. I came away thinking, gosh, is he the best they've got? It was a very canned interview. They wanted all the questions in advance. He seems very nice, as like a genial, avuncular guy. But boy, was I wrong. I mean, he led China in a very complicated period, and I think you look back, he did surprisingly well. He and Zhu Rongji really did a pretty impressive job in China, and he was pretty committed to developing a relationship with the United States. Other leaders, I'm not really in a position in terms of any personal interactions. I haven't had any with them. It's interesting though that Hu Jintao has never given an interview to foreign reporters in his whole time as president, which I think is unfortunate. It's unfortunate for the press, but I think it's unfortunate for China too, because the press is not going to go away whether you like them or not. So the challenge is how to interact with them in ways that sort of advance your interest while giving the press enough of what they need that they feel they've got a story. And I think leadership could probably do more in that area.
Okay, now the floor is open, so we go around. I know a lot of hands.
Right to left or left to right?
We're going right.
Okay. Right. You're a rightist here.
Right. Oh, you're sitting on the right side. So go from this side.
I'd like to make two comments about the media in general and how it reflects in terms of China. One is that I have a radio program that's on community public radio, so I'm completely unfettered by any kind of commercial concern, and I regard my job to be really educational and promote deeper understanding of China and the United States, and I have the rare opportunity to do that because of public radio. I've also been in the new energy field for over 10 years, and one of the things that I'll start with is that in 1992, Dan Rather at one of the national media conventions said, I came to the media because I was inspired by Edward R. Murrow, and I wanted to make a difference, and I wanted to be an investigative reporter. And here I am, almost toward the end of my career. He was maybe even 2/3 of the way. He said, what has happened here is the networks have been taken over by moneyed interests, so that instead of being like Edward R. Murrow, we are told Make nice, not news. Whatever you do, do not antagonize the president, the government, the mayor, because we won't get access, we won't have the money we're trying to produce out of the news division, and so on. That means that when investigative reporting happens, it's a lot easier for American journalists to do it by outing stories in foreign countries, because that doesn't embarrass their financial interests back home. So I can see where the Chinese might feel it was biased, that actually, you know, when investigative reporting is applied by American or Western journalists to China, it's not applied with the same rigor within the United States for the reasons that we're told. So I see that's one of the weaknesses we've got in our society, that is the control of the money, like Dick Durbin talking about Congress is owned by the banks. The media is also owned by financial interests that makes them less effective here within our country. But also then they go for the easy thing of what you said, I think very interestingly, that they fail to make the important things interesting, meaning they go for conflict. They don't go for education. Now, one of the exceptions to that I saw was Evan Osnos in December of 2009 in the New Yorker, where he wrote this excellent article called The Green Giant. I've never seen it covered anywhere else, in which he said that scientists came to Deng Xiaoping back there in March of 1986 and said, you know what? You know, we got coal, that's right, but if we're going to try to rise as an economic power and we rely on fossil fuels, we're going to choke our country to death within 30 years. They gave him the same kind of message that Amory Lovins tried to give in Foreign Affairs in 1976 of why we had to get off fossil fuels and move to renewable energy, that was ignored by the Reagan administration and under obviously the pressure of the oil and gas industry. What I found out in the Evan Osnos article was that Deng Xiaoping formed the 86-3 project, and they've been working on maximizing renewable energy for almost 30 years now. So it didn't just come out of nowhere that they've taken the lead in many aspects of renewable energy while we have languished. And if that had been reported widely, it could have been encouraging to those forces within our society that say, hey, let's do something sensible like a moonshot for renewable energy, and let's learn from China. Let's be inspired by them. Let's look at what they're doing that's really innovative that we could, you know, learn from, rather than kind of demonizing China and say, oh, you know, they want to be a competitor and they want to, you know, challenge us and so on. I see very little of that kind of openness and informative educational interaction cross-culturally, so we could, China obviously has problems. We have major problems, as we can see from the Occupy movements. China is actually doing some things with respect to debt financing.
Excuse me, could you get to a question? There's a lot of people with questions here.
Okay, fine. So, I mean, those are the two things.
Well, I would say that I think the commercial pressures do play a role, because the networks are increasingly under pressure to get ratings, and so, you know, if it's a choice of green tech in China or Michael Jackson's doctor, you can be pretty sure which way it's going to go. You mentioned the New Yorker. One of the things is, given the nature of the story in China, long-form journalism. I mean, Evan Osnos or Peter Hessler, who preceded him, people like that, have done some of the best reporting on China precisely because they don't have to feed the beast. They don't have to file, you know, stories for the wire every day. Is there an easy solution? No. I think, in fairness, there are a lot of really serious, smart people in these news organizations, and you just wage this constant, unending, frustrating, often more unsuccessful than successful fight to do what you can to increase the space, because that's, you know, if you're in those, or you go to places like where you went. But I think, you know, I think a lot of those frustrations are shared by people more broadly in the media.
Okay, so now we have a rule. Nobody can talk more than 3 seconds. Okay, so try to be brief and with a question mark. So we go, okay, here, we go by the rule.
I have a question about China's role in the world economy, because since it starts opening up to the world economy, it's been reformed a lot, but we see the Chinese currency rate is still very much under control of the government. A lot of the other part of the business and the production procedures are not exactly up to the market. So So do you think the Chinese market can really be, like, truly be part of the world economy like every other country does?
Well, you know, if you start in the 70s, when China was almost totally disconnected from the international economy, in 30 years, China is inextricably linked to the global. China is a member of the World Trade Organization. It's a huge trading partner for so many countries. It's involved in, you know, it's got major interests getting natural resources. So it's very, very involved in the global economy. And it's very, very complicated. You know, I'm not an economist, and I can't claim to know a lot, for example, about the currency issue. But you know, in fairness, the renminbi, when I was in Beijing, the renminbi, I got 8 renminbi for the dollar. Now I get 6. That's a lot in China. And also, this is a country whose growth has been driven by these export industries. And people complain, you know, lots of issues there, and in China there's complaints about, you know, sweatshops and all the rest of this. But I mean, this has been an important engine of growth, and I'm sure that there are lots of people working in these industries who, given a choice of working 10 hours, you know, making gadgets in some factory in Guangdong province, or spending 12 hours a day behind a water buffalo in Hubei, they would, for a fraction of the money, they would say, thank you very much, I'll take my 10 hours in the factory. I don't care if the conditions are bad, it's a lot better. So it's a, you know, you have to sort of see this in some context. But I think the Chinese are trying to sort of figure out where they go next. I think that's one of the big issues now, is that they sort of did a lot of the easy stuff, and I think they're sort of trying to sort out what they do. They've gotten to this point. What do they do next? How do they manage it? But I think they are extremely dependent on it. I mean, without the international economy, you don't have a China boom. Without people like us buying their products, without China's economic, without all the foreign investment, it's not. I mean, it's not a pure market economy, and there are lots of questions and so on. But I think that the Chinese integration with the international economy is a major fact of life, and it's accelerating. I don't know if you disagree.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah. So, move on here.
Yeah, I'm interested in, because I don't know that much about China internally, what process is there, if any, for people to complain, like with the environmental issues that I've been aware of, human rights issues? All the things that are going, are people squelched? Are they suppressed? Or are they able to speak freely to whoever the communist is at the local level to get their addresses, their concerns addressed?
Yes and no is the answer. You know, one of the problems in the Chinese system is you have all these incredible dislocations produced by all these changes, and they don't really have an effective mechanism for people to voice their grievances. And so it's very ad hoc. It depends very much on the situation, on who the players are. You have one of the interesting things about the Chinese internet is that even though you have censorship, an awful lot of stuff gets out, and you know, including people complaining, venting, exposing malfeasance in one sort or another. And some people say, oh, the internet's going to help bring the Chinese Communist Party out. I think the opposite. I think this actually strengthens them, because I think it's one of the safety valves they have, and it's a way of keeping tab on public sentiment. You know, you had this episode in December in this town called Wukan in Guangdong province. Like 20,000 people in this town chased the local officials out because they were angry that some corrupt local official in cahoots with some developer was going to essentially give away all their land. And this was very tense, and there was all this concern they were going to send in the police, the army. In the end, the thing was diffused peacefully. One of the protest leaders, I was told, I read, just became the party secretary there. So they're, you know, on the one hand, they can be very rigid and brittle, and on certain things that involve challenging the mandate of the party to rule, like the Jasmine Revolution, they'll come at you with a ton of praise. And they're very spooked by intellectuals who raise certain issues. On the other hand, you often see very deft I thought that was a pretty skillful way to do it. And so far, most of these, in Dalian last summer, big city, there were big protests because there was a chemical plant that people were worried about, and they agreed to shut it down. And I read more recently it's still operating, so stay tuned, you'll see what happens. But it's more complicated, it's more nuanced. Some officials in some places are skillful, some officials are clumsy. Most of the protests, and there are, I think, 180,000 is the figure of the year. So divide that by 365 to get a sense of how many per day. But most of them are really local, and as long as they're local, they're manageable. The fear that I think the authorities have is if any of these start taking on a broader national political character. It's one thing to complain about a corrupt local official and a sleazy property developer or a chemical plant. It's another to say, down with the Communist Party. The reality is, in a lot of these protests, people look to Beijing to come and solve their problems. They see the central government as a force for good, and it's the local officials. And one of the challenges for the central government is, because of all the changes and the reforms and the liberalization of the economy, the writ of the central government doesn't extend in a sweeping away. Beijing can't simply issue an edict and it's automatically followed. That's an issue, for example, with intellectual piracy. The central government gets it, but in a town where the place running the factory turning out the fake DVDs employs 100 people, and the local guy who runs it has got good ties with the local party deputy secretary, it's hard to do. Same thing with the environment. They have on paper very good environmental legislation, but again, to shut down a factory that's central to employment in an environment where local officials see generating growth as the key factor in promotion, it makes it much harder. So it's very messy, but they don't have sort of fully institutionalized mechanisms, which is partly why it's so kind of bubbling and brewing, partly why it's so ad hoc. And that's one of the central challenges. They've got to, it's not talking democracy, but they've got to figure out some way, because you can't change society that fast without winners and losers and victims and what have you. And if you don't have some way to adjudicate all of these things before it becomes a broader political thing, then there is the danger, which I think the Communist Party recognizes, that people will start concluding it's not just a local problem, it's the whole system that's making it impossible to solve the local problem. And then it gets dangerous, but they're not, I don't think they're anywhere close to that yet.
Okay, move on.
The Economist has projected that China will pass the U.S. in nominal GDP in 8 years, 2020. The IMF says a little later. How will that impact the U.S.-China relationship?
I don't really know, because it may be true, it may not be true, but there are so many other factors. And as I say, these internal issues in China are very profound. And I mean, I think if the perception that the Chinese leadership and people have is that they are just completely on a rise and that the U.S. is a downfall, is in decline, and that is going to embolden them to push in certain areas, then that could be a recipe for tension. But I'm not as I say, I'm not an economist, and my father used to say there are lies, damn lies, and statistics, so I wouldn't take everything absolute face value. And in terms of its implications, I don't know, because I think China is in many ways a very fragile society, because it's got all of these forces at work. So the growth rate may continue, but all of these problems may hold them back from becoming, the great power. And same thing here. I mean, they may be able to fix some of the problems. So I'm really not sure. I think anytime you have a rising power and a status quo power bumping up against another, it's a recipe for tension. And it's going to require very intelligent management at the top to start with. Let us hope we have intelligent management at the top, and that they have intelligent management at the top.
I think you've identified the problem.
Okay, we move on over there.
Yeah, I was just curious if you have a feeling for what they think about global warming. They're building a coal plant, once a week, and we can't take care of energy security with the XL pipeline.
I think intellectually they understand global warming. certainly at the top, they understand it. I think they also feel that it's unfair that we in the West got to spend 100 years fouling the environment to produce these modern economies. And China, starting from this low base, still in the middle of that process, is being asked to take steps that they feel would curb theirs, so we didn't have to do the same thing. On the other hand, there is a certain element that, yeah, maybe that's too bad, but if you don't do it, we're all in deep trouble. So it's partly a sense of their, so I think intellectually there is an understanding, but there is also the sense that it's unfair. And there is this other element that I alluded to before, which is that for the last 30, the post-Tiananmen Square, Deng Xiaoping concluded that for the Communist Party to stay in power, it had to generate enough growth and prosperity to keep people satisfied. And there has been this kind of unspoken understanding or bargain between the party and the people, which is that we'll give you the opportunity to get rich, have, improve your lives, and you don't challenge our monopoly on power. And by and large, I think a lot of Chinese have accepted it because the opportunities have been there. I mean, you look at the transformation in China. But what that means is that this is a system where generating growth, jobs, muting discontent, preventing unrest and opposition is far and away the top priority. The local officials' careers are going to depend not on how many trees he plants, but on how many people he keeps in work, or whether he has protests and so on. Now, if there's a shift, and there are signs that this may be happening, if there's a shift in that consciousness about the environment is becoming a really big issue, then that could affect this kind of calculus. And there are for example, in Beijing, where you had this unbelievable pollution, I don't know if many of you have followed this, the U.S. Embassy monitors the level of particulates, and they put out a daily reading, which is of a much greater detail than the Chinese reading. So the Chinese reading says it's a nice day, and the American can't even see the American Embassy figures say that you shouldn't even be walking outside. And because of the pressures, they're going to change their reporting there. The protest in Dalian was over a petrochemical plant. So it's not, it's a fluid dynamic. It's not rigid. And, if that becomes a really big issue, then it could have consequences. But, and I think they get it, but at the same time, they've got, what's the figure, 14 million new people a year. I mean, some incredible figure they got to figure to feed them, clothe them, dogs, all the rest of that. But on the other hand, if pollution is starting to kill people and it becomes a drag on growth, and people are angry about it, and if you have this sort of emerging new middle class that feels that one of the things they want, in addition to having a car and an apartment, is air they can breathe, then that could have an impact, although it's sort of hard to judge how fast and in what way that will play itself out.
Okay, back to you have questions.
Thanks. I'm Bill. We both export to and import from China. Comment and question. The comment is the business press has tremendous amount of China coverage,
right.
Bloomberg, et cetera. So if you want to, that's a good way to follow issues that are important to me. Second is my question is there room for a Kenneth Clark BBC in America equivalent for educating the U.S. about China? Or am I going back too
Kenneth
far?
Clark.
Am I going back too far?
He did the big TV series.
Yeah. He did a BBC series on America
Right.
to explain America to Europe.
Well, there have been these efforts, but I think the one-off thing is better than nothing, but is not. Diane Sawyer went for a week a year ago for ABC, and for every day she anchored the World News Tonight and had all these pieces, and then it dropped off into the ether. If it were me, I would urge just a more consistent commitment to regular coverage of issues. And I suspect you could generate interest and an audience, but if you did it properly. But it requires bucking the trend and being willing to fight all the advertisers who say, I'll give you an example. I don't know how many of you saw my film on the Nixon trip, but It's a really interesting film, and I thought that I approached the History Channel. The guy at the History Channel said, this is a great idea, but every time we do something on China, our ratings nosedive, so we don't do anything on China. Shocking. So you have to be very proactive and make a decision. This is as important. This is important enough to us as a country that those in the media world have a responsibility to try and make the important interesting in ways that will engage people. And I don't see it happening very much.
Okay, so move on.
Taiwan, Tibet are obviously two big sore points between the U.S. and China. How do you see the future of those two, and is the U.S. expression of policy on those issues, do you think it's mitigated by our concerns about North Korea and our desire to enlist the Chinese in our policy to North Korea?
On Tibet, I mean, the two are completely different. Tibet is a very sensitive issue for China, but the United States doesn't recognize Tibet as anything other than part of China. The issue is decided, in my view, the issue is decided. No Chinese government is ever going to let Tibet be independent. It's part of China, that's the fact. It's increasingly populated by Chinese. You can argue whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, but for all, and Tibetan culture is clearly something that is ought to be treasured and so on, but the game's over in terms of the status of Tibet. It's been over for a long time, and I don't, the ritualistic meetings with the Dalai Lama, fair enough, he's an admirable guy, I've interviewed him, he's a wonderful guy, but that's completely different. There's no question that it's part of China, it's going to stay that way. Taiwan is a lot more complicated. The U.S. has this you talk more about this than I could, but you just came back from observing the election. The American interest now in Taiwan is that it not become a trigger for conflict. So I think under the Taiwan Relations Act, the U.S. also feels an obligation to provide Taiwan weapons. But the key U.S., because Taiwan is the one place in the world where everything went completely disastrously, horribly wrong, the U.S. and China get into a shooting war. So the key U.S. interest is to prevent that from happening. And the trends recently are, from that point of view, pretty positive. Ma Ying-jeou has accelerated cross-strait engagement, investment, trade, travel, tourism, education. He just got another 4-year term to further accelerate that trend. I think there is some concern, obviously, in Washington about China's military buildup, which is to a large degree predicated on the notion of being able to prevent the U.S. from intervening effectively in any conflict over Taiwan for long enough for the Chinese to be able to sort of decide the outcome on their own terms. But with Ma Ying-jeou in power, it's hard to see why that scenario is going to become realistic, unless domestic questions in China change the equation or something unexpected happens. So I think Washington heaved a huge sigh of relief when Ma Ying-jeou won, simply because there are enough really big worrisome problems that if Taiwan is on the back burner and will stay on the back burner, they're very happy for it to be there. I don't think I think the U.S. is pretty blunt with China on issues like North Korea and Iran, and the Chinese decision to pursue what they see as their interests and ignore certain American exhortations has to do with Chinese calculation of their interests. And in North Korea, their main interest is not having chaos, upheaval, or collapse, both because that's bad in and of itself. It could prompt, military intervention by the Americans or the South Koreans, and also because they're concerned about, there's a school of thought in China, it's not universally shared, but that the U.S. trying to blunt China's rise, and a pro-Western, a united Korean peninsula with a pro-Western government and a security treaty of the U.S. That borders China is not in China's interests. So they're very happy to keep propping up North Korea as a buffer, as well as because they want to prevent turmoil. And in Iran, it's their third most important source of oil and energy. They need that to keep the economy going. They don't have the scruples about dealing with nasty regimes that the U.S. does, although in fairness, the U.S. scruples are often very selective. And it's what's the old saying, they're bastards, but there are bastards. I mean, there are plenty of unsavory regimes. Hosni Mubarak, the Kingdom of Saud, and others that the U.S. deals with, so you can understand why some people are skeptical. But they don't. They're doing a lot of business with Iran. What's going to be interesting from the Chinese point of view is if they feel the choice is they better get on board and do something, because otherwise the Israelis really are going to attack Iran, because if the Straits of Hormuz get closed, the Chinese are going to really be hurt. So there, it's a very tricky diplomatic balancing it. But I think these are just done, I don't think the U.S. pulls any punches on other issues because of Taiwan.
Okay, because of time and constraint, let's take several questions together. Okay.
Okay, mine's maybe a little long, but basically has to do with the Chinese leadership. We're going to be witnessing the fifth generation of Chinese leadership in the Politburo this year, or like between this year and next year. So where exactly do you see this new fifth generation taking China? For example, looking at some of the potential appointees, there are some people who look like they're the same kind of pragmatists that we have, but there's other people such as Guo Xilai from Chongqing, who had a successful Red Song campaign over there. Do you think that there might be a little tension in the Bureau, or do you think that they might try to regress or continue to open up? Last mini question to that, how would you see the increased power of the princeling faction in the Politburo affecting the nature of Chinese leadership?
I can answer it. Let me just say that very quickly. The short answer is, I really don't know, and I don't think they know. That's one of the issues. There are clearly, it's surfaced in the Chinese press, there are clearly differing opinions about what to do, different approaches to governing China. And I think, even though we know who's going to probably be number one and number two, all this other stuff is very unclear. And that, I think, is one of the big problems. Because if they can't agree among themselves on a direction, then it's going to be hard to address all of this enormous list of problems that we talked about.
Last weekend, Taiwan just had its presidential and legislative election. And it seems to me that the Chinese government cautiously allowed the domestic media to report the election during the whole campaign. And I noticed that I checked the Senate website. There's a whole web page collecting all the information, news about the election. And according to a very unreliable source, it is estimated there were about 0.2 billion Chinese watching the election through internet, perhaps. Maybe not 0.2 billion. I don't know the exact number. And I read some of the very interesting Twitter message commenting election results, Tsai Ing-wen and Ma Ying-jeou, and it seems that I admired their Tsai's concession speech. So what would your observation or comments that any kind of impact from this election on the Chinese public, people who are watching the election? Because I noticed there's some discussion about whether democracy is possible in China, whether Chinese people deserve to have democracy just like Taiwanese. Yeah.
Well, it's a very interesting question, and I think the answer is it clearly resonated among a lot of people. There was a tremendous interest. Taiwan is the most successful Chinese society that's a democracy. And what that means practically in China, anybody's guess. But this is part of this general ferment, changing in thinking. It's one of the interesting consequences. Everybody talks about China absorbing Taiwan. What's the impact of the contact going the other way? There are all these Chinese who are visiting Taiwan, studying in Taiwan. There are Taiwanese living and working in China. There's making marriages, all these connections, and there's an awful lot of information about Taiwan that gets through. And one of them is they had an election in which you had an opposition that ran, criticized the president, lost, conceded, no chaos. So chew on it and see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen, but it's one of these interesting things to watch.
If you could just say a few words on your thoughts on what's happening in North Korea.
I think, I don't think it's going to collapse. I think the transition is going pretty smoothly. I think the entire elite in North Korea, whether in the military or the ruling party or the government, are all invested in this dynastic system. They need, I mean, Kim Jong-un, the successor, is the grandson of Kim Jong-il, so he has the royal blood. So I think the issue for me is sort of not whether Kim Jong-un is going to survive, but what's the constellation of forces below him and what the policies are. And there have been some very interesting kind of signals or hints. One is continuity, continuity, continuity. Well, continuity means in the fall they were very heavily engaged in talking to the United States, and they were on the cusp of a deal, get food aid in return for some concessions on the nuclear front. So if that picks up, if they follow through on it, that's very interesting. When I was in Pyongyang in August, I saw some intriguing, really only straws in the wind, but there were more cars on the streets, there were restaurants, there were markets, there were people with cell phones. It reminded me of China, sort of 1977, kind of. Mao was dead, the reforms hadn't started, but you could sense something was in the air. I don't know if anything's in the air or not, but it was interesting to see. They're clearly focusing on the economy is important. Kim Jong-un gave an interview to Korea Central News Agency the other day, and I think he used the term economic reform. In terms of North-South relations, they don't want to deal with the current South Korean government, but the likelihood is there'll be there's a presidential election at the end of the year, and whoever wins is likely to be more open to engaging with North Korea. So it's not in their interest to do anything outrageous with South Korea. So I think the great danger now is simply one of sort of miscalculation, accidental conflict. Or if something happens that makes the North really feel threatened and prompts them to lash out. Absent that, I think it's steady as she goes for a while.
Okay. Last question. Okay.
Well, two last questions.
Yeah, two last questions.
Okay. Do you think new media such as Weibo, you mentioned in your lectures, will become new, engine for Chinese political reform?
I don't know whether it will become an engine for sort of formal reform of the system, but I think it's a very, very important phenomenon. It's a way to allow people to express themselves more than they've been able to do. It's a way of voicing complaints and grievances, of putting out information. It's a way for the government to keep track of public sentiment. So in that sense, it might actually, ironically, be a way of strengthening the system. So I'm not, I'm pretty skeptical about political reform anytime soon, because I think which is I think unfortunate, because they've got to have some mechanism to manage all these problems. But I think as a phenomenon that's going to allow people a voice in a way that they haven't had it before, I think it's very, very important.
As you have last to say.
What can we do in the United States, perhaps in our schools of journalism, or to solve the problem that you have been talking about?
Well, everybody should take his China courses. Well, promoting study of China, promoting engagement with China, learning Chinese, traveling there, encouraging people to go into careers involving China. Journalism schools ought to look at programs that will get people exposed to China, encourage them to make, the China beat part of what they want to do. Language study is really, really important. And more interaction.
Are these Confucius Institutes?
Yeah, they're one vehicle. At a time when money is tight, and if there's money that will help people study Chinese, I think that's good. That's hardly the only thing. But I just think in general, China's really important, and people owe it. It's in their own interest to know more about it, because what it says and does internationally and domestically is going to have an impact. Better to know something in advance to be able to manage it and they have it come up and bite you on the backside because you didn't have the clue.
With that,
Any other questions?
I don't think we will take any more questions at this point. You can have a private conversation if you still want. And now we can end on time, almost 1:30. And so our next event will be on February 10th. We have Larry Donahue. He was a West Point officer and then became the president of the Colorado Catholic University. He has been in China many times to talk about West Point leadership concept in Chinese cadres. And so he will talk about how Chinese side responded to the West Point leadership concept. And so, and also our conference in May has also settled May 4th. The subject of the conference is Beyond History, the reconciliation and the new sources of conflict between China and its neighbors. So mark your calendar if you are interested. We have this conference is joined with the Chinese Zhejiang University, so we have a delegation from China, and also we have scholars from Japan, Korea, South Korea to join the conference. Okay, with that announcement, please join me to thank Mr. Shirota. For a few more minutes. Yes, you have